Hi, welcome. Part of the content on this channel is educational, and I provide information about relationships, verbal communication, emotions, and the huge part that bonding and connection plays in all our daily interactions with each other. However, there's also another part in which I focus on our values as a society and also look at certain current issues going on which I want to contribute and say something about. And that's where we're going today. Specifically, I want to comment on the response of the world's mainstream democracies, including the United Kingdom, to the pandemic in relation to one of the core values of democracy, the freedom to speak. So let's start by giving a little background to that very important cornerstone of democracy. I think the vast majority of us understand the basic principle of free speech, and our agreement together is that it is a fundamental right for us all to ask questions, express our opinions and views even when they're different from others or others do not like and agree with them. This directly contributes to protecting democracy and liberty and making sure that our institutions act in accordance with the spirit of the basic values and principles that underpin our society. We all need to feel confident and secure that this agreement especially extends to and applies to our governments, politicians, mainstream media, and the major institutions that we place our trust in to safeguard and be the gatekeepers of democracy. My sense is also that the vast majority of us agree together that the right to free speech is not absolute, but that it does have an extremely wide application, and the majority of us generally know, understand, accept, and agree with what the boundaries and limits to that application are. This very wide expression and latitude was and has been the long-established and prevailing default position in the United Kingdom and other mainstream democracies around the world prior to 2020. However, that changed virtually overnight in these very same countries, including our own, the UK, following the initiation of COVID-19 policy and response. And it did so in this way. It started with social media companies censoring the content of individuals and groups who had questions, raised concerns about, or challenged the main COVID policy narrative and response of the government and mainstream medical community. They were labelled and accused of spreading misinformation, and this was claimed as a justification for having their content censored. Let me pause just to say something about the use of this word misinformation. First and foremost, somebody who says something is misinformation without providing comprehensive supporting evidence, and ideally the opportunity for right of reply, is essentially at the time just expressing an opinion, however confident they sound. It's easy and quick to state it, and it sounds factual, authoritative, and claims to know the truth absolutely. Nevertheless, it's just an opinion until it has been examined much more thoroughly, even when a person or institution that we trust tells us that it is the case, and we wish to, or it is convenient for us to take their word as gospel. When it is said by politicians, those that work in medicine and science, and mainstream media, for instance, like the BBC, huge numbers of us who trust these sources implicitly will just accept what we're told without questioning or doing any comprehensive research, and then be quite likely to repeat this to others as fact. We all do this to a certain extent, especially when we are aligned with a particular opinion or inclined to accept and believe the speaker based on their past record and our confidence in them. But it doesn't mean that just because somebody says it, whoever they are, that it is indisputably true. And it serves us and freedom very well to be able to remind ourselves of that fact, particularly when a current trusted institution acts in such a way or says something that catches our attention that is at odds or incongruent with the values of democracy that they normally espouse. For we all live in a world that has duality, and for lots of reasons, people act and behave in ways that do not always measure up to the standards that we might expect or wish from them, or indeed they from themselves in normal circumstances. It is not always by any means with malign intentions that they do so, but occasionally it is, and then that needs to alert us. It is also true that we all need to trust people, otherwise it would be difficult to live our lives in a relaxed, secure and happy way. So it's always very helpful to retain the faculty of critical and objective thinking, for this helps us all in the short term or over time see whether something is originating from the light or the dark side of human nature. Now back to how this accusation of misinformation and censorship by social media that initially followed the main response to COVID-19 continued to escalate and intensify towards certain individuals and groups. The use of the word misinformation was not just confined to social media companies, but began to spread universally to governments and MPs, mainstream medicine, mainstream media, and other agencies in most democracies, including our own. However, this censoring and accusation of spreading misinformation was not only focused towards the lay public, which in terms of free speech is worrying enough and surely not okay, but most disturbingly and shockingly included the content of some of the most credible, highly published and qualified doctors, consultants and scientists around the world. These practitioners reported that whatever science and data they presented, a normal and inspected thing in medicine and science, as evidence to support what they were saying on social media, none of it made any difference, and the social media companies either ignored or labelled it under the heading of misinformation. This was done by somebody who had supposedly fact-checked them, but was never revealed in person or their fact-checking typically substantiated. If and when these doctors and scientists asked for an explanation of what they had done wrong, they received none or nothing meaningful. However, this story doesn't end there with just censorship on social media for these professionals. As the label of misinformation began to become a buzzword around the globe, it included their reporting being shunned by former colleagues, losing positions of leadership in prestigious organizations they belonged to because of what they were saying, and were discredited by various media organizations and experienced professional and personal gaslighting. If this was not enough, in many cases they were threatened with or actually lost their jobs, including leading or senior positions in hospitals and other medical or academic institutions. They also revealed that on a number of occasions colleagues privately contacted them or communicated that they actually supported their position but were too afraid to say so publicly because of having been warned within their institution about saying anything that went against the prevailing narrative. Were they to have done so, they were threatened with the loss of their job, income or academic funding. Not only this, but some of these concerned and censored doctors in early 2020 started coming up with therapeutic protocols that included using safe, repurposed drugs to try to help and treat patients who were ill with COVID, and reported that they started having success. Surely a normal thing that any concerned, good medical practitioner would try to do for patients in the face of nothing else apparently being available and being done. For the general official message early on in the pandemic from the medical authorities was that there was no official treatment for COVID-19 and you should wait at home until your lips went blue and then only as a last resort go to hospital. As a result of offering these treatments, a number of these doctors were warned off against continuing, and subsequently a number have had investigations instigated by their medical bodies and organizations with a view to having their license to practice medicine taken away. Now, I'm not a scientist or an academic, but I have respect for the scientific method and principles when it is applied in its best traditions. But my immediate response is that something is very wrong here, and that this clearly constitutes a red flag that should concern every single one of us that believes in democracy, and a caring, considerate approach to all that we encounter in terms of whatever daily life serves up, including pandemics. Here were a number of highly qualified and highly respected medics who were just doing what is normal practice in medicine and science prior to the pandemic, and yet, incredibly, were being gaslit and pilloried for it by virtually all and sundry, and most notably by their own medical bodies and organisations. Does the sun now rise in the west and set in the east? This extreme authoritarian and autocratic reaction in response to the mainstream medical community, in particular to its own practitioners, who were helping treat suffering patients with some success, seems to be clearly antithetical to and at odds with some of its own prior established basic principles relating to the practice of good medicine and science. As such, it appears to be totally inappropriate and looks from the outside as malfeasant and abusive behaviour towards these individuals. What were these doctors endangering that it needed such an authoritarian response? We were repeatedly told the mantra of, "We're following the science, so let's look at that principle now." Well, if you're following the science and the principle of science and the scientific method, you'll regularly hear from its proponents and those that work in it that the science is never settled, that one of its basic core values is to challenge, and that this is welcomed, assumed and expected. And the purpose of challenge is twofold. One, it is a means of establishing whether something works and can be demonstrated objectively to do so, and is repeatable. And two, in doing that, it also looks after the safety of the patient, which is obviously vital and all-important. Hence, the often named Hippocratic oath that those who train in medicine take. First, do no harm. So those scientists and medics who had something to say on social media that was not in step with the mainstream response, not only were acting totally in accordance with the previously established norms and principles of science, but also those of democracy. Yet it appears that by having an opinion, they had to be destroyed. As far as I can see, we should thank them for decency and care and showing the way and having the courage to do their duty and uphold the norms of democracy and good medical practice on behalf of their patients and the rest of us. Instead of which, some of the bastions of democracy demonized them or said nothing or directly or indirectly supported others doing the same. And here I'm including governments, oppositions, mainstream media, and medical regulators and institutions. I mean, during COVID, what happened to investigative journalism, who we expect and normally are always looking to challenge governmental policy and actions? They largely became a mouthpiece for government and led or joined in with the misinformation claims. Are we supposed to believe that this fits in and happened because there was a perception of a national emergency and you mustn't question anything? That maybe seems understandable possibly for a little while at the start, but 2.5 to 3 years of the press virtually giving everything a buy? Instead of being recognised and appreciated for acting from and demonstrating professional good and caring principles that they were supposed to by their medical oaths and the best principles of science, they were subjected to censoring, bullying, gaslighting and threatened with their jobs and licenses to practice by their own medical bodies and organisations. I mean, has the world gone mad? It has suddenly flipped from what it used to be and is now back to front. It seems to me it is the medical bodies who are in breach of the values of science and the Hippocratic oath, and not these brave, courageous and caring souls. The incongruity of it all is stark and quite staggering. Okay, I'm going to put in the tablature below the video some links that directly refer to some of what I've been describing. Otherwise, I suggest you do your own additional research. So let me summarize and distill the main points that I'm making. Free speech has always been a cornerstone of all democracies around the world, at least until apparently the last 3 years. Then, specifically in relation to the policies in response to COVID-19, anyone who asked questions or challenged the prevailing narrative and policy were accused of spreading misinformation. this word became weaponized and convenient to throw at anyone who presented a different view. It didn't matter who, layperson or highly qualified medical science. In the case of the latter, they were accused and pursued in the most undemocratic fashion for just upholding the ethics and basic principle of medicine and science. I think it is reasonable to say that the tenor and some of the actions of various individuals and institutions that have done this fits that of a persecutory religion. It is very hard to see and understand what could have motivated them to act in such an aberrant manner. Can we put it down to the psychology of the human being? Namely, for governments and other institutions, the fear of being blamed and accused of getting it wrong and therefore responsible for countless deaths and the guilt that would go with that? Or blinded by that morbid fear, there was a desire and a need to compel everybody to follow the chosen policy, and anybody who didn't had to be scapegoated, controlled and crushed? Maybe. Or there was and is an agenda that is not obvious for us all to see, to account for this inexplicable behaviour. Perhaps even a mixture of the two. Because fear and the accompanying desire to control can make potent bedfellows in human beings, to move away from the normal parameters of decency and democracy as the human race has seen to its cost down throughout history. When this happens, actions often follow that show the darkest side of human nature. But whatever the reason, it must not and cannot justify or excuse it. Surely government and the main institutions that represent and protect democracy have got to do better than that, haven't they? We have to ask and expect them not only to do a functional job of looking after our interests and keeping society running, but also in the operation of doing that, care, consideration and love, yes, love, has to be demonstrated and woven into the fabric of their discourse, narrative and actions. For if we are to ever become a highly evolved species, we may not and must not compartmentalize the practical function and running of society separately from the normal considerations of caring behaviour to all. We have to find a way to reflect compassion and soul in all that we do. Our values and principles are not things that we can play fly-by-night with, and we discard them when something comes along and presents the human race with a big challenge. They are dear and precious to us because they define who we are, and we value them and need them to stay clear and strong in whatever difficult circumstances life can throw at us, the human race. We cannot just cherry-pick when we're going to operate from them and when we're not. We must not allow that which separates us from and can diminish our connection with love and each other to win out. For the enemy of love is fear, and that word, interestingly, is also an acronym for false evidence appearing real. In other words, fear and false evidence often go hand in hand. So finally, to finish, what I would like to have seen from all governments, MPs and mainstream institutions around the world was what I would have hoped, assumed and expected from any benign democracy. Namely, a stance that demonstrated and reflected first and foremost the values and principles of democracy and free speech. Above all, one in which questions or challenge of policy and response was not seen as a threat to be destroyed. Instead, in the best principles of the scientific method, those questions and challenges could act as a valuable means of checking whether the initial or current policy was continuing to act in the best interests of the whole, or whether it needed adjusting. Everybody working together, and when some of the public also had a voice and opinions that differ from the mainstream approach, that is not something that needs to be feared, controlled and censored by government or any other behind-the-scene actors or agencies. When a government is secure, confident, and most importantly is transparent in all that it does, and acts with love and integrity, that gets transmitted to the population and affects how they will respond. We human beings are naturally diverse in how we see the world, and we have many different opinions, and some of these may differ from the prevailing mainstream narrative in the moment. However, that is not something that should be seen to threaten democracy or act as a justification for abandoning the foundational values and principles upon which democracy is founded, including free speech. Thank you for listening. I think the subject today is extremely important for us all to talk about together. So if you like some of what I've spoken about, please let as many others know about this particular video as possible. And please hit the subscribe button so that you'll be informed about future videos. Thank you.